So these are my notes from the Bad Bug book released by the CDC. So this will talk about gram-negative bacteria, and it's the second part, part 2. I'll be talking about Brucella, Vibrio cholerae serogroups 01 and 0139, Vibrio cholerae serogroups non-01 and non-0139, Vibrio vulnificus, Chronobacter, Aeromonas, Plesiomonas, Shigaloids, miscellaneous bacteria that are in our guts, Francisella tularensis. Yeah. And I'll also end off talking about pathogenic E. coli groups. So Brucella, it's carried by certain animals and leads to miscarriages when infected. Other than that, there are no other significant ill effects. Bacteria can be transmitted to people and cause brucellosis, aka undulant fever. It produces fever, high fever and sweats that comes and goes for months to years. Usually associated with farmers who help deliver calves, drinkers of unpasteurized milk. It can be treated for a longer time than other infections. It can be treated with antibiotics. Human-to-human transmission is rare, and livestock are vaccinated against brucella. Most human cases are related to raw milk consumption, and it's more common in developing countries. The death rate is low, but can lead to fatal complications. So Brucella, the bacteria, it's a gram-negative non-spore-forming bacteria. There are 6 main species. They're intercellular parasites and replicate in phagocytes in the hosts and then multiply, and it's usually associated with the immune system. So there are strains that are CO2 dependent and are more suitable for surviving inside hosts, but not enough information on the survival outside hosts. Each Brucella species prefers a particular host. Brucella abortus is the CO2 dependent strain, and it's usually found in cattle, elk, and bison. Brucella neotome is found in desert wood rats and is known to infect humans. Brucella ovis is found in sheeps. It's also a CO2 dependent strain and can infect humans. Again, it's usually transmitted animal to human, and it's a zoonotic disease, and it's highly contagious, but it's rarely human to human. Usually through occupational exposure, so work related, birthing, or consuming raw milk. It's rare, but it's possible to transmit it through breastfeedings, and there are no vaccinations for humans. The most notable symptom is intermittent fevers, chills, sweating, and weakness. Can lead to other infections too, such as septicemia and bone infections. Orally, from consuming raw milk, it can get into us. Inhalation, usually common in lab settings. Skin contact entry from animal workers. And human to human via breastfeeding. And it's most commonly found in raw milk consumption. And target populations are those who work with animals and consumers of raw milk, and it's more common in Latin America. So Vibrio cholerae 01 and 0139. There are many kinds of Vibrio bacteria, but this one causes cholera. If untreated, it can be fatal. And this can exist, the bacteria can exist in fresh and salt water. It's transmitted through water contaminated with feces or eating contaminated seafood. Bacteria produces a toxin which can lead to watery diarrhea, and vomiting can occur too. And it's preventable through proper cooking and proper washing with clean water. So these serotypes, 01 and 0139, they're gram-negative bacteria that naturally occur in aquatic environments. They can produce a toxin called cholerae toxin, or CT, and toxin co-regulated pilus, so TCP. This serotype is very different compared to other Vibrio bacteria because it can produce toxins. They are a very hardy bacteria and can survive in fresh and salt water. They are susceptible to cold waters, disinfectants, and acidic environments. It's important to note that Vibrio cholerae 0139 is an encapsulated cell. Onset of cholera is very quick, can take hours. It leads to severe watery diarrhea, leading to fluid loss and dehydration, and enters us orally through fecal-oral route. So the bacteria enters our intestines and produces toxins, which causes electrolytes and water to exit the intestines. It's not common in North America, only sporadic cases. It's mainly in Africa, and it's associated with seafoods, water, ice, and unwashed foods. Target populations are poor areas with high densities, and children suffering from malnutrition tend to have more severe cases. Next, we'll talk about Vibrio cholerae non-01 and non-0139 serogroups. These bacteria, the non-01, non-0139 serogroups, do not cause cholera, but it can cause diarrhea that's self-limiting within a week, and it's not really a watery stool. Immunocompromise can form blood infections, commonly found in salt waters, rivers, and oceans, transmitted through contaminated water and seafood, and can be prevented through cooking. Vibrio cholerae non-01 and non-0139 is commonly found in brackish water, so somewhat salty water, and can survive in freshwater and open oceans. It's important to note that this bacteria does not produce the CT toxins, but it produces cholera-like symptoms, and it does not cause cholera. It's a lot more hardier than other Vibrio bacteria, but is susceptible to cold temperatures, freezing, and acidic environments. Cooking kills it, and it's not an encapsulated cell. Illnesses with this are usually self-limiting, usually found in coastal areas and consumption of raw and improperly cooked seafood. It's really dangerous for immunocompromised people with liver disease, and consumers of seafood. Vibrio vulnificus does not cause cholera, and it often does not cause illness, but when illness occurs, it is fatal. It's found in estuaries, so where fresh and saltwater meet. Infection from ingesting contaminated water or seafood can be serious and cause blood infections and can be killed by cooking. It's usually found in oysters. They're gram-negative and associated with plankton and shellfish, and common in coastal waters, again found in oysters. It's usually killed immediately in fresh water and is weak to acid, freezing, and cooking. It's less common compared to other Vibrio species, and its onset of symptoms can take hours. Cases are sporadic, and it's more common when waters are warmer. Next, we'll talk about Chronobacter, formerly known as Enterobacter sakazaki. It's very risky for newborns. Illness is usually rare, but is very high risk, again, for newborns, and the death rate is very high. This bacteria can survive in dry environments, particularly in baby formula, can lead to permanent brain damage in infants, and it's important to make baby formula correctly using warm water and refrigerating properly and not leaving it out for more than 2 hours. Chronobacter is a mobile pathogen that's a gram-negative and can cause foodborne illness. It's common in infants and immunocompromised people. And again, it can survive in low moisture foods such as powdered infant formula. So mortality is very high for infants. Onset can take a few days, and some symptoms infants can show are poor response to feeding, irritability, jaundice, grunting respirations, instability in body temperature, seizures, brain abscesses, and developmental delays, and can lead to death in children and neurological complications. So the main source of this bacteria is powdered infant formula. Again, it can survive in water availability of zero point 0.2, can survive up to 2 years, and can also be found on bread, rice, cereal, fruits, vegetables, herbs, and spices. Target populations are newborns and infants. Next, we'll talk about Aeromonas. So this bacteria can cause illness that takes different forms. Usually causes diarrhea that's self-limiting. This bacteria can be found in fresh and salt water and can cause gastroenteritis in humans and animals. Onset's less than 24 hours, usually self-limiting, and it's mild diarrhea, and it's similar to dysentery. So similar to dysentery, meaning it produces a lot of diarrhea and can lead to dehydration. But again, it's self-limiting, so it's not as huge of a concern. It's commonly found in fish and shellfish, meat and produce. And target populations include children, elderly, and the immunocompromised. Next, I'll talk about Plesiomonas shigaloids. These are found in freshwater and recreational water. It causes illness through unsanitary drinking water and contaminated seafood or produce. It takes a lot of bacteria to cause illness, and the illness is usually self-limiting. And the most noteworthy symptoms are diarrhea that's usually green or yellow and foamy. So it's a gram-negative bacteria found in fresh waters, so lakes, rivers, and streams. It can also be found in cold and warm-blooded animals such as fish, dogs, swine, cattle, monkey, toads, vultures, and snakes. And it's not usually found in humans. It doesn't immediately cause illness, and it usually resides in the gut flora. And it's killed by pasteurization. Onset takes 20 to 50 hours. Again, the most notable symptom is the green-yellow diarrhea, sometimes foamy, and it's usually underreported because the illness is mild. So next we'll talk about miscellaneous bacterial enteretics. So these bacteria are normally found on healthy people and don't often cause illness through contaminated food. They do cause illness sometimes, and it's usually unclear why, and they cause GI symptoms. So very quickly, I'll talk about Klebsiella, Enterobacter, Proteus, Citrobacter, Aerobacter, and Providentia. So again, they're mainly found in environments such as water, produce, and usually reside as normal gut flora in us. Usually found on healthy stool with no disease. So Klebsiella. It's ubiquitous and common in food and water. It's heat stable and produces enterotoxins. There are few foodborne cases. It only causes illness when there's a high number of bacterial cells, and it's usually found in unpasteurized milk. Proteus. It's usually found in the urinary tract and wound infections. It's a source of nosocomial infections, meaning healthcare-related infections. They can metabolize proteins in meats, and it's usually associated with histamines produced in... So Proteus can produce histamines in tuna and cause rhomboid poisoning. Next, I'll talk about Serratia. Serratia. It's not usually found in the human gut flora, but it's an opportunistic bacteria common in healthcare settings. There are also antibiotic-resistant strains. Next, Enterobacter, usually found in soil, water, sewage, and vegetables, and is associated with infant formula, but it's a different makeup than Chronobacter. So Citrobacter fruendi, it's an opportunistic bacteria found in our gut flora. Can also be found in meat, and it produces diarrhea in hosts. And it can also produce Shiga toxin, and it can lead to hemolytic uremic syndrome. Next, Providentia. It's associated with urinary tracts, but it can also colonize the GI tract. I'll talk about Francisella tularensis. It's a disease that causes tularemia, otherwise known as rabbit fever. It can take on different forms depending on how the bacteria enters our body. If it enters us orally, so through food, it can cause throat and intestine infections. It can spread to vital organs. It can cause excessive bowel damage. Again, it comes from undercooked meats, particularly rabbit meat, and contaminated drinking water. It grows slowly but can live in soils for long periods of time and can survive acidic environments. And it's important to know it dies during cooking. So, tularemia, so rabbit fever, can be caused by bites of insects, cross-contamination of food and animal products, and an ingestion of food. It's treatable in the early stages, and mortality is low, but it can usually cause secondary infections, which are fatal. It can produce different symptoms based on how it's entered into the body. So it can cause throat infections. If you eat it, it can cause excessive bowel damage. Insect bites can lead to sudden chills, fevers, and headaches, and enlarged lymphs. And aerosols are the most deadly form and have a high mortality if untreated. And it can cause pulmonary tularemia and can lead to brain damage and death. And it's commonly associated with undercooked meats and infected rodent drop-ins and contaminated water. Lastly, I'll be talking about pathogenic E. coli groups. So E. coli is one of the most predominant enteric species in the human gut, and it's part of the normal gut intestinal flora. It can provide health benefits such as preventing colonizations of pathogens in the gut. However, a small group of E. coli are pathogenic and can cause disease in humans. There are 6 recognized groups of E. coli. 4 of them, which I'll talk about in depth, are pathogenic in foodborne illnesses. They cause foodborne illness. So first we have ETEC, which is enterotoxigenic E. coli. It produces toxins and is associated with traveler's diarrhea, but it's usually self-limiting. Next, we have enteropathogenic E. coli, EPEC, which is usually found in lower developed countries. It's severe in children and has the presence of locus enterocyte effacement, or LE. These are special genes associated with GI illness. It's very infective in infants and can cause death, and it produces rapid onset diarrhea, and it does not produce a Shiga toxin. Next, we have enterohemorrhagic E. coli, EHEC, and it's part of EHEC includes Shiga toxigenic E. coli, so STEC E. coli. That being said, EHEC E. coli produce Shiga toxins, and E. coli 0157H7 is a part of this group too, and can lead to hemolytic uremic syndrome and takes days for onset. And lastly, we have enteroinvasive E. coli, EIC. It's called EIC. It's similar to Shigella and can invade epithelial cells and causes a mild form of bacillary dysentery. And onset's quick, it's self-limiting, and it's usually misidentified with shigellosis. So just a quick recap of E. coli. ETEC E. coli is usually associated with traveler's diarrhea and is self-limiting. EPEC is associated with LE, so the special group of genes. It produces rapid diarrhea and does not produce toxins. That's EPEC. EPEC has LE, rapid diarrhea, and no toxins. EHEC produces the Shiga toxin and includes E. coli 0157H7, EHEC. And lastly, we have EIC, so EIEC. It's similar to Shigella and produces dysentery, so a bloody diarrhea. And that concludes the Bad Bug book notes on gram-negative bacteria and pathogenic E. coli.